Great. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Abby Swanson, and our group will be presenting our research entitled Human Rights and Democratic Performance. We have been studying the causal relationship between the adoption of specific human rights legislation and protection and comparing it to the level of democratic participation within that given state for any given year. The main topic, or the main question that we are addressing, we are attempting to examine the relationship between the time of adoption between various areas of human rights and the level of democratic development of that state at the time of adoption. Specifically, we center our focus around three main areas of human rights, including women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and labor rights. We believe that through examining the pre-existing data, we will find that these three subsections of human rights typically coincide with different levels of democratic development, and that there is a clear timeline associated with the realization of these rights. With labor being the most likely to get adopted first, women second, and LGBTQ rights third.
So with this timeline, we aim to create that timeline with human rights protections in various countries to grant us a better understanding of how these protections correlate with each other and with democratic performance. By looking at our data, we will be able to figure out whether or not there's an average time between the adoption of different areas of rights. If we find out that for most countries, women's rights are adopted, say, 20 years after labor rights, or that LGBTQ rights are adopted roughly 30 years after women's rights, that's important. Then we can predict when states will adopt other areas of rights based on when they adopted that first set of rights. We will also be able to see what the level of democratic performance is when these different rights are adopted, and perhaps predict when areas of rights will be implemented based on their democratic performance. If women's rights are usually implemented at a certain level of democracy and a state is getting closer to that number, then we might expect them to adopt women's rights soon. We can also put these measures together for what might be an even more robust prediction by finding out that LGBTQ rights are usually implemented at a certain level of democracy, but only after women's rights have been implemented for around 20 years. Of course, these numbers I use are just examples, but after looking at our data, we can find out if there are any strong connections between these variables, and if there are, then we can predict when countries will implement rights in the future.
When looking at women's rights, we are primarily using good right here? Okay. When we're looking at women's rights, we're primarily using qualitative and quantitative data to measure the implementation and reformation of domestic policies in regards to women's protection, and both international agreements overall. Examples of this might be the maternal mortality rates, UN involvement, international involvement in treaties such as CEDAW, or reproductive rights and education rates. When looking at these, we primarily observe two camps that show the relationship between the consolidation of democracy and the level of gender inclusivity present within the state. The first being that women and gender protections develop prior to democratic transitions, and the second being that regime types will determine the level of women and gender protections and inclusivity. Throughout most of our research, we've found that human rights and democracy mutually reinforce each other, but we intend to see that the implementations of women's rights typically correspond with different levels of democracy, and that there is a clear timeline associated with the adoption of women's and gender inclusivity.
Looking now towards LGBTQ inclusion rights, it's clear that LGBTQ individuals continue to face significant barriers worldwide. In order to measure this, we will be using Wang et al.'s 2017 model on women's rights and democratic performance and translating that into LGBTQ rights. Comparing the empirical studies of LGBTQ people with gender inclusivity developments, and the researchers have reasoned that similar exclusive and intolerant policies have resulted in less economic output. Looking further into different literature that we've used in our background, we first looked to Hilbrand et al., which found that after analyzing 73 countries that participated in the fifth and sixth wave of the World Value Survey, to measure national attitudes towards LGBTQ rights, utilizing an analysis of a moderated mediation model after Wiesel and Engelhardt's 2008 examination of the between regime type, level of modernization, and responsiveness to public preferences. That developed democratic states with high levels of modernization typically demonstrate higher levels of LGBTQ plus rights, although it is less likely that states that have strong cultural ties to conservative religious institutions exhibit the same trend. One explanation for that can be found in the research of Shapiro from 2011, Dahl from 89 and 95, and Stimson from 2007, where they found that using their empirical analysis comparing autocracies and democracies, that democracies are far more effective in integrating public opinion into national policy, as government responsiveness is structurally reinforced through mechanisms of electoral accountability that are absent in autocratic regimes.
So one of the big questions that comes to labor rights, especially when we analyze labor rights in correlation to democratic rights overall, as well as other human rights protection, is a sort of chicken or egg question. So the idea is, which came first, labor rights or general democratic performance? There's a lot of, these are two big schools of thoughts, and there's lots of evidence on either side. But to summarize, with labor rights, it's this belief that labor rights play a crucial role in the initial building of democracy. This is because of factors such as trade unions heavily encouraging electoral participation, which increases worker enfranchisement in the liberal democratic system. How labor unions tend to reduce income inequality, and when we measure income inequality, we see that there's a strong correlation between income inequality and democratic performance in countries, both with appearances of corruption as well as actual power that citizens have in that democracy. And then on the liberal democracy side, we have this idea that robust labor rights are just an outgrowth of liberal democracy. And so these are supported by ideas such as workers having equal access to the ballot, speech, and gatherings, as well as basic voting rights, expanding the imagination of what democratic participation can look like. So if you're able to vote in your local or national government, you start thinking, why can't I vote at my workplace? So with the labor rights, you have studies such as Labor Rights in a Generalized System of Preferences, a 20-year review by Al Kampa. And with the democracy, you have studies such as Labor Rights in East Asia, Progress or Regress by T.L. Caraway. So of course, you might be asking yourself, can we have both? And yeah, there is a sort of emerging school of thought where it's the general idea is that liberal democracy is essential for labor rights to emerge, but then labor rights strengthen democracy as a result and continue to upkeep it. So you have general ideas from both sides here, so there's no ability to organize a labor movement under an oppressive government, really, as well as the potential to foster solidarity, which prevents populist backsliding. You're not going to get mad at immigrants so much if immigrants are part of your union. As well as that, in our research, we found that labor rights typically emerge as one of the first initial human rights, and then the rest follow. The big asterisk, though, to keep in mind is that there are socialist countries that score high on labor rights, but then low on liberal democracy. So as a result, many liberal democracies began using metrics that gauge independent union participation instead of labor rights.
So now we're going to talk about specifically what data we used and how we used it. So first off, we're going to talk about the methodology behind this. Specifically, the VDEM data sets that we used are the women's rights and labor rights we used specifically from VDEM along with our Participatory Democracy Index. Our LGBTQ rights, which we will go into later, was from a different source, but in order to compare them, we're going to standardize the LGBTQ rights in comparison with the Participatory Democracy Index. And
yes, so the Participatory Democracy Index questions what extent of the percentage of the population within the state actually participates in their democracy. So it looks at subnational elections and political participationary groups to collect a score between 0 and 1, with 0 being less democratic participation and 1 being more.
So on to women's rights. So with women's rights, we use the Women's Political Empowerment Index from VDEM. And this includes figures for a global sample of countries from 1900 on to the current date. Not only does this index from VDEM look at the civil liberties afforded to women within a state, it also looks at the action women can take outside of the government, specifically looking at the discussion of political issues along with the participation in civil society organizations. Furthermore, it also looks at the amount of women within formal political positions. This index also tracks women's empowerment from the 1900s to the current year, as I mentioned before, but each country is ranked from 0 to 1, and you can see in our brief overview of the data is that it's slowly increasing, as VDEM has pointed out to us too, but 1 is the highest, the most empowered women, and 0 is the lowest amount of women empowerment.
Onto our data set for LGBTQ protections. We use the Global Index on Legal Recognition of Homosexual Orientation. This was compiled by several scholars from the Netherlands, in which they looked at the relationship between LGBTQ inclusion and how that relates to economic development overall. So using data from 132 countries between the years 1966 and 2011, the authors provide evidence that exclusion of LGBTQ people results in economic harms. The researchers score each country on a scale of 0 to 8, with 8 being the most comprehensive legal protections offered for LGBTQ persons. And they illustrate that approximately a $2,000 increase in real GDP stems from inclusive measures for LGBTQ people. We plan to incorporate this index along with the participatory index to compare the two variables.
So next is the exact data points for labor rights. We use first the engagement in independent trade unions. The key word in there is independent, so they can't be controlled by the state. And it measures it by a percentage of the population. It's measured on a 0 to 4 rating, with 0 being 0 to very little % of the population participates in a union, and a 4 is 26 or more. Moving on, we also looked at how power is distributed by socioeconomic status, both in theory and in practice. Again, it's rated from a 0 to 4. The 0 being that the upper class has a complete monopoly on political power within a country, and a 4 being that the lowest class, or the lowest socioeconomic class, has an equal amount of political power as all of the other classes, equally distributed based on population.
So although we haven't quite finished our research, we do have some expected findings. Generally speaking, we believe that states will first adopt labor rights, then women's rights, and then finally coming around to LGBTQ rights if they even adopt them at all. We expect a state's adoption of a new category of rights to coincide with an increase in their participatory democracy index. We aren't exactly sure how much this increase will be, nor do we have a prediction for the level of democracy, which will be when different rights are implemented, but we will be able to figure that out once all of our data is compiled. And then once that data is compiled, our timeline will hopefully show that an increase, that as democratic performance increases, protections for human rights will also increase. And that is all we have for our presentation, so thank you for joining us.